The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 7th chapter. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" Jesus said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then Jesus called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of the Lord. One of the difficult things that comes along with being a Christian or identifying as a Christian, one of the hazards of our faith is a certain expectation of good behavior, of righteous behavior. You may have felt this pressure yourself or expected this of others, and there's no escaping it. It's a simple fact of our existence. As Christians are just as moral creatures. We believe certain things. We believe big things about God, about God's love and plans for the world, that God has invited us to participate in this work in the world, a certain expectation of behavior. And we probably spend a good chunk of our lives looking and examining, evaluating whether our beliefs, the person we claim to be, matches up with how we behave. We may think this about ourselves. We have a certain self-image, and then hold ourselves accountable or responsible for our behavior. Or, as is often more common, we look at other people, see how the person that they claim to be, the things that they claim to believe, and then look at their behavior and see if it matches up. So we sense that we want some connection in ourselves, in our neighbors, between what we believe, and how we behave. But we often struggle to have a close connection. I recently, or a couple years ago, got a reminder or an illustration of just how difficult it can sometimes be to maintain this connection between belief and action through a counterexample of a friend of mine who I felt beautifully modeled what she believed through her actions. We met a few years ago, and it was at a time in my life when I was especially concerned with beliefs, this belief side of my brain. I'd recently left Washington, D.C., and a career in politics, where this notion of sort of hypocrisy and saying you believe one thing and acting a different way was very much in the water and part of my life. But I'd moved to North Carolina, and I was in school trying to figure out what I believed. And I became friends with a woman who was working that other side of her brain. She was very much concerned with how she acted and how she lived out her faith. She had a strong faith and was articulate about it, but she was really concerned with how she lived. And she worked for a research or technology company in their human resources department. And she loved her job because she got to spend her time and her days with people who were sort of in transitions in their lives. They just moved maybe from out of state, didn't know people, and she got to be the person who could show them around the office, who could be a voice of welcome. Or then people who were leaving, and she got to be sort of a voice of encouragement as they were leaving and heading off to new places. So she had this connection between her faith and her actions. I was so impressed that I asked her, and I was so concerned about the church and belief, I asked her, had she considered perhaps serving the church in some formal or informal role? And she scoffed and dismissed this notion and explained how she'd been raised in a church, in a denomination that did not really value the gifts or opinions of women. And she, as she put it, she'd spent enough time in her life with people who said that they believed things, but whose actions didn't match up. And so she had her ministry, her vocation, her work, and that she was going to focus on that. Now, through this sort of example, we see perhaps how rare, and that my response to this was, well, what do you believe, and can you get back to the church? This is how rare and how hard it can be to have this close connection. Now, this friend of mine who I have lifted up, James, who comes to us this morning in our New Testament reading, would love this friend of mine and would similarly exalt her, because James is concerned primarily about what we do, how we live, not as concerned with belief. As James says, be doers who act. Do not merely be hearers who forget and deceive themselves. And again, putting it even stronger, James says, if any think they are religious, but do not show it by their actions, their religion is worthless. Their religion is worthless. And so through James and this friend of mine who I've lifted up, we have sort of this topic of what is the connection between our faith, what we believe, and how we behave. So we're perhaps challenged, invited to consider sort of where on the spectrum are we? Are we people who are concerned more with getting our beliefs right, our faith right? Are we doers or actors? Where are we sort of in this spectrum? And yet, as we hear from James and raise this topic, some of you may object to this even being the premise of this sermon of our scripture reading. You may be thinking to yourselves, I thought I came in this morning to a church with the word Lutheran on the title. And if there's anything that we think that we know or stereotype as Lutheran, it's that we don't care about how people act or behave. It's about what you believe, faith. Sin boldly was what we were told to do, perhaps in confirmation class. If you're thinking along these lines, you're not wrong, for this book of James was not Martin Luther's favorite book. He once referred to it as a letter of straw. A letter of straw that you'd put in a barn, nothing solid, nothing you could build a life on, no foundation there. And he doubted whether this book, this letter of James, should even be in the Bible. Now, to dive a little into the history, we can perhaps sense and agree and understand, because we don't like this notion that we're judged solely by what we do. We don't like this notion that there's a microscope on us at all times, that we're not allowed to make mistakes. In Martin Luther's day, he didn't like the notion that people would feel pressured or shamed into giving money to the church so that their loved ones would supposedly then get their ticket into heaven. And so we're wary of this James reading. We're wary of the notion that we have to do good works. And this works thought, this James thought, creeps into our lives, probably in ways big and small. A couple weeks ago here at Zion, I made a pastoral visit in which this tension between faith and works was very much on display. And the person I was talking with, as I read through James this week, this conversation came flooding back into my mind, and she gave me permission to share a little of our conversation this morning. She came to me in distress, and she recounted, this woman, how she'd grown up in a sort of strict church environment, strict family, constantly feeling micromanaged and judged. And she realized that as she'd grown up and had her own family and was raising her children, that some of this anger had stuck with her, and now she was inflicting it upon her own family. And as this anger was building up inside of her, she said that a friend of hers had confronted her and said, "You have to forgive these people. You have to forgive your parents and your children, and if you don't, wait for it, you will go to hell." And so we've seen in our lives where we've felt and sensed this pressure to behave, this pressure to have our works right, lest we be judged harshly by others or by God. Now, what could I have said to this woman? Well, we consider this morning the possibility, the probability, in fact, the certainty that God is big enough, loving enough, and powerful enough to take care of both of these aspects of our lives, to both get our faith, to get us right with God, and to work to get us right with our neighbors and coworkers. As this first friend in North Carolina, as this example I lifted up, and as this woman here at Zion longed for, to get both our faith and our works correct. For even in James, even in this supposed letter of straw, we hear these words of this powerful, generous God who does all of this for us. Even in James, we hear this grace and this gift, as James says that it was in fulfillment of God's own purpose that God gave us birth by the word of truth. The word of truth. And James says that we should welcome with meekness the implanted word. The implanted word that has the power to save your souls. Implanted, let's think about that word. Not planted, as in we went and planted. Implanted word. Welcome it with meekness. With meekness, we receive this implanted word in the same way that a seed, without doing anything, welcomes the rain and the sun, which allow it to grow. This notion of the word brings us back to Genesis 1, when God speaks and says, "Let there be light. Let there be creatures who are good." This positive word. And then generations later in John's gospel, in John, a book that Martin Luther did like, which begins with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this Word became human and came down to dwell among us. We've seen its glory, full of grace and truth." So we have ample evidence of this word, this implanted word that made us, that came down from heaven to be with us, that came even out of the grave to be with us again. This word, this implanted word that we receive with meekness, which has the power to save our souls, which gave all of us enough to say to our friend from Zion, "No, you do not need to be concerned about your past. You do not need to be concerned about your struggle to forgive. The implanted word is in you." Our only thing left to do, now that we've received this implanted word with meekness, is to go out and allow it to grow in us. As one person says, the question that James really poses for us is, what do we do now that we don't have to do anything? And it's perhaps telling that James's instructions for what we are now to do remind us of God's grace for us and that we don't have to do anything. As James says in his description of pure religion, is that it is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress. To care for orphans and widows in distress. So in other words, we will go out, and spend time with people who, if they had been left to their own devices, or left to the world's judgments of them, might think that they'd done something wrong, might think that they were being punished. But because they have this implanted word and God's claim on them, these orphans and widows in their distress receive this love from God and from their neighbors. So now that you don't have to do anything to get right with God, go remind people of that, remind ourselves of that, remind orphans and widows of that. And for each of us in our own contexts and lives, we'll carve out our own place, our own little niche, where we can receive this word and then go share it with the world. At this start of a new school year, start of a new program year at church, I've been spending a lot of my time, and in my role in working with youth and families, I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about how we can make that environment for children and families here one where they don't fear being judged, don't fear not being good enough, but can receive this word meekly and be built up. And last week, after we had our blessing of the backpacks and sent the children off into school with a word of blessing, and afterwards I gathered with some of our Sunday school teachers for this forthcoming year in the FLC. And even in our discussion, there was some of this tension between faith and works being brought out. Some of us are not teachers by profession or by vocation, and so perhaps a little anxiety about that. I'm still trying to hone and find the best curriculums. But as we talked through the year, we talked through who the people were in our lives, the teachers in our lives who we remembered, who'd been a blessing to us. And it was interesting as we went around, no one really said that it was about an amazing work that the teacher or the Christian had done for them. It wasn't their amazing knowledge. It wasn't about their degree or the curriculum that they chose. But invariably, that teacher treated me like I was important. They treated me like my opinion mattered and I was cared for. We might say that these people who were impactful in our lives treated us like this implanted word was in us. They treated us like they saw this word, this value, and this worth inside of us. Because they saw that or felt that or believed that, they came and they cared for us. They cared for us who needed it. And so we can build that ministry for youth and families. We can build it in this congregation. We can build it in the world. Because God's hands are on us. God has implanted this loving word inside of us. We can tend it, receive this water and sun from God, go out into the world and share it with others. In Jesus' name, amen.